Hello. Last night, we had Dr. Michael Gehler with us. Michael Gehler is Professor for History and the head of the Institute for History at the University of Hildesheim. He's also a seasoned researcher and, of course, a full-blood academic. He has published well more than 300 individual commentaries, articles, and books in his very impressive career on Austrian, German, and European contemporary history. He has received various prizes and awards and is one of Germany's and Austria's top historians on contemporary European history. He gave us last night an insightful lecture about a topic he knows extremely well, namely early Austrian neutrality. The lecture carries the subtitle From the Hungarian Crisis to the Rapatsky Plan and Raab's proposal for the solution of the German question 1956 to 1958. He explains especially well these formative years of Austria's neutrality, because, as you know, it was, of course, invented in 1955 and then carries forward until today. Toward the end of the seminar, he will also tell us more about his recent books on the topic, but for now, please enjoy his talk.
Thank you very much, dear Pascal, and hello to everybody. I'm really pleased and happy to be invited from your side, and I will let you know what I'm doing today. Yes, you know, in 1955, the Austrian Parliament decided on the state's perpetual neutrality, immerwährende Neutralität, within the framework of a federal constitutional law. And it's a very brief thing. 2 points. First, it states the following: for the purpose of permanently asserting its independence vis-à-vis the outside world, and for the purpose of maintaining the inviolability of its territory, Austria declares of its own free will its perpetual neutrality. Austria will maintain and defend this neutrality with all means at her disposal. The second point, very brief: in order to safeguard these purposes, Austria will not join any military alliances in the future and will not permit the establishment of military bases of foreign states on its territory. End of quote. That's it. What I will do now, I will divide my presentation in 5 points. I will let you know aspects on Austrian foreign policy before 1955. Secondly, the subchapter, the title of this subchapter is Detachment from Germany through Neutrality. Detachment from Germany through neutrality in 1955, and the Hungarian uprising as a test, a first test of Austria's neutrality. The third part will focus on the consequence of the Hungarian uprising and the Austrian reactions, Austria's renunciation of supranational integration in 1956, very early, and this guided the way till Austria's, policy at the end of the Cold War. The fourth chapter, the fourth point, will be alternative integration solutions, the Rapatsky Plan, and different attempts at mediation in the German question 57-58. And then I will conclude with 5 points, with 5 theses. So let me start with 3 preliminary remarks. For a better understanding of the history of Austria's foreign policy after 1945, some basic notes on its prehistory are necessary. First of all, Austrian foreign policy in the so-called interwar period was characterized by the imperial loss of the Greater Habsburg monarchy. This imperial loss was expressed after 1918 in the strong orientation, let's say sometimes total fixation on the German Reich as a new space of hope, a new space of refuge. This desire to belong to a new area, to a new metropolitan area found expression in the so-called Anschluss movement, Anschlussbewegung, in the years from 1918 to 1933. Second, Mitteleuropa, the Central European ideas, served only briefly as a means of compensation, and the pan-European concept remained a pipe dream, even though the Pan-European Union, with its headquarters in the Vienna Hofburg, tried to build an ideological protective dam for an independent Austria and against National Socialism. Third, neutrality as a foreign policy status played practically no role at the Ballhausplatz in the years from 1918 to 1938. Let's come to my first point, to my first subject chapter. It's Austria's foreign policy before 1955. After the Second World War, Austria was occupied by four powers, as you well know, which observed, which controlled, which intervened. During the period from 1945, 1947 through 1953, decisions were made that would set the course for the future. The first steps are taken in the direction of cooperation with Western European governments, with the formulation and propagation of the so-called victim thesis, Opferthese, the so-called victim thesis. So Austria as the so-called first victim of Hitlerite aggression in 1938. In the years 1945 and the following years, Austria came back to that Moscow Declaration from 1943, where this victim thesis was also mentioned. And one could use this victim thesis for the claim, for the demand for the return of South Tyrol. This seemed to be justified. It served also the victim thesis as a kind of good legitimation for receiving foreign aid. Think about the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration aid, or think about the various American aids like governmental aid relief in occupied areas, the interim and expanded interim aid by the Congress, and last but not least by the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan. The integral South Tyrol matter could not, however, be pushed through. So autonomy, that was the case. Rather, there was only a questionable autonomy solution, which was followed by decades of strife. The victim status of Austria that was successfully asserted also supported the thesis of the special case. Austria as a special case within the OEEC in terms of Western European orientation policy. Austria's participation in the Marshall Plan had priority in the years 48 to 49 and 50, much more important than concluding the state treaty, much more important than the question of neutrality, orientation and non-alignment. So the preservation of a unified state in this divided Europe through the European Recovery Program for the entire country, also for the Soviet occupation zone in the East, ranked in significance ahead of the conclusive resolution of Austria's international status. It was a search for balance that was always difficult for Austria, along with a tightrope act between East and West. And this was necessary in order to maintain also the four-power consensus in Austria and not to threaten it. That also led to the fact that membership in NATO came in no way into question. And in the best case, only a secret, let's say, pseudo partnership with the West could exist in terms of security policy. In the meantime, the European Recovery Program mutated from a welfare and aid program into a reconstruction and modernization program for Austria, for Austria's economy. Its Western orientation took place through the process of trade liberalization within the framework of the OEC, starting from 1948, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade from 1951. But the ERP, the European Recovery Program, was also effective through the counterpart funds. Through its membership in the European Payments Union, the EPU, Austria had participated early on in a multilateral balance of payments in Western Europe. Within that context, a clear reorientation took place of Austria's foreign trade in the direction of the West and the more or less secret handling of the United States embargo policy against the East. What was consensus was to be member of the OEC, but not really at this time, let's say 50, 51, 52, to be member of the coal and steel community. What was very conspicuous and considered by France and the Soviet Union in an increasingly critical manner was also that trade relations and economic involvements with the Federal Republic of Germany becoming closer and closer, which was a result of the secession and the decrease of trade with the East, and which threatened to turn Austria into an appendage of West Germany. And this was very closely, critically observed by Paris and Moscow also. Against the background of the German question, the still open German question that had remained open in the years 1952, 1953, Austria, with the maintaining of the four powers administration, appeared in contrast to be a good example for the German solution. An initial cautious approach with the Council of Europe began early on. Austria got an observer status in the Consultative Assembly in Strasbourg by the National Council, by the National Parliament, by the Nationalrat, starting in 1949. Austria also occupied the same position with the high authority of the European Coal and Steel Community in Luxembourg. Austria had an observer status there up to 1953. After the end of the Marshall Plan program in 1953, when new options emerged for concluding the state treaty, Austria stopped further steps toward European integration policy with the ECSC, the Coal and Steel Community, in 1954. In spring of 1955, Austria made use of the window of opportunity for finalizing and signing the state treaty through a 4+1 solution with the four occupying powers. The Austrian solution with state treaty and neutrality also triggered a multifaceted international debate about the possibility of a model case for Germany, with which, however, Vienna behaved in a restrained manner. New complications should be avoided. Before 1955, state treaty negotiations in many cases moved in the shadow of the German question, which was more important to the victorious powers than Austria was. In any case, in 1955, Austria realized its state unity and independence. In contrast, the division of Germany and the dependency upon the respective superpowers continued to exist. Even after 1955, Austria did not become a real secret ally of the West. Furthermore, it was to turn out to be unrealistic and even illusionary that in the event of a hypothetical attack from the East, NATO would defend Austria. The intra-German border had absolute priority for the Atlantic Military Alliance. The Austrian army was itself not NATO compatible, and thus there was no talk of a real so-called secret ally of the West. If Austria's access to Strasbourg and the Council of Europe was still waiting, if Austria's access to Strasbourg and the Council of Europe was still waiting and hesitant in the years 53 and 54, then after the concluding of the state treaty, it was all the more decisive, which already led to full accession as early in 1956. Austria became member of the Council of Europe, in contrast to Switzerland, which joined just in 1963. Let us summarize the prehistory. Between 1945 and 1955, however, Austria managed not to let the Cold War escalate in its own country. And this was the real achievement of the political elites of the Second Republic, especially since it ensured the country's cohesion. Austria benefited from the Marshall Plan's European Reconstruction Program in the OEC, starting from 1948, and it joined the Council of Europe as an active member in 1956. Austria now defined itself as largely convinced of the idea of Europe and its possibilities for unifying the continent. However, the state treaty with its Anschluss prohibition, Anschlussverbot, according to Article 4, whether economic or even political, and the perpetual neutrality of the federal constitutional law of 1955 prevented the desire for full integration into the Western European integration project until the end of the Cold War. I'm coming to my second point, detachment from Germany through neutrality, 1955. In contrast to previous research, the years 1955-56 should be seen in a stronger, bigger context. On the one hand, in terms of sovereignty and integration policy. On the other hand, in terms of their consequences for the German and Hungarian question. 1955 was not only an act of emancipation from the occupying powers, but also an expression of Austria's independence from the German question. The decision in favor of neutrality in 1955 was a suitable means to the desired end of liberalization and of liberation from the Allied, especially the Soviet occupying powers. Neutrality was enshrined as a federal constitutional law for external security and reassurance in Moscow. So it's important to argue that Austria, following up with the 55-year and the 60s and the 70s, always can demonstrate her status as a EFTA member state and as a neutral state, not FRG with NATO and EEC, not GDR with Comecon and Warsaw Pact. So this is a clear position which was also internalized by the diplomats. We are not Germany, we are not West Germany, we are not East Germany, we are not EEC, not NATO, not Comecon, not Warsaw Pact. We are neutral and EFTA. Let's come to the second part of the second point, the Hungarian uprising as a test of Austrian neutrality. Vienna had to pass the test of its still very young neutrality under the sign of the escalating Hungarian crisis. Austria's foreign policy tendency toward non-alignment, which became increasingly official in 1952, 1953, went hand in hand with the first signs of a relaxation of its relations also with Hungary. Already at an early stage, easing effects of non-alignment and later on neutrality became noticeable in the fading out of the First Cold War. It is also important to mention here that the resumption of trade relations preceded this new foreign policy development, and the intensification of economic exchange promoted political détente, the so-called semi-détente. Though neutrality alone was not enough to ease neighborly relations, the Austrian federal government immediately took a position on the events in Hungary in autumn 1956. The fighting had already lasted 5 days, and the Soviet tanks were still proceeding against the population of Budapest, to which Chancellor Julius Raab said at the Council of Ministers meeting on October 28th that as the Austrian government, I quote, "we cannot remain silent about what is going on," end of quote. And Raab, the Chancellor, Julius Raab, Austrian People's Party's Chancellor, laid down the government's position, I quote. "But we must have the courage to point out our special position and say that we do not agree with the events and the deployment of tanks. Austria's special action is based precisely on our neutrality, and we are standing up against the inhumanity in Hungary, end of quote. So from the beginning, the Austrian Council of Ministers took the view that the Soviet Union did not intend to violate Austria's territorial integrity. Foreign Minister Leopold Figl, also belonging to the People's Party, ÖVP, stated at this Council of Ministers meeting on the 28th of October, I quote, "I believe there is no danger to our national territory, but we must prevent anything that contradicts neutrality," end of quote. Early on, first surprising Austrian self-confidence emerged to decide in the forms of its neutrality itself. The USSR had no interest in discrediting, rejecting, or even destroying too quickly the neutrality product, which was also a product from her own, in which it had itself participated. Austria's political interest thus focused on claiming and preserving its neutrality. Yet, at the cabinet meeting of the 28th of October 1956, not all members of the government were clear about the importance and the significance of Austrian neutrality. I give you one example. Fritz Bock, also belonging to the People's Party, who was responsible for trade and reconstruction, referred to what he considered to be the neutrality enshrined in the State Treaty. But this was erroneous and had to be corrected immediately by Foreign Minister Figl. On the basis of its own federal constitutional law of the 26th of October 1955 on perpetual neutrality, the federal government was obliged to defend the inviolability of its territory with all available means. There was no mention of neutrality in the State Treaty, which Bock argued in the Council of Ministers. You see how young this process was. Austria's Minister of Justice at the same time, Otto Czardek, still in the Council of Ministers meeting of the 28th of October, ordered the publication of the state's precautions and measures for the protection of neutrality and asked the justified question, I quote Otto Czardek, Minister of Justice, "But what happens if the invaders are stronger than our troops? If the Austrians fire only 3 shots, we will have defended our neutrality in spirit," end of quote. So for the Austrian government, it was especially important to demonstrate that armed intervention without military resistance would not happen again, as it did in March 1938, when the military Anschluss of Austria to the German Reich by the Deutsche Wehrmacht took place. As in 1938, against the German Wehrmacht, the Austrian armed forces of the Federal Army, the Bundesheer, would not have been able to stop the Soviet army at the borders any longer in 1956. So what did the federal government? The federal government immediately decreed 7 measures to which it could subsequently refer in response to Soviet accusations of alleged violations of neutrality. First, the establishment of an Sperrzone, an exclusion zone at the border by the Bundesheer, by the Federal Army, with the prohibition of access for unauthorized persons, also journalists. Second, the inspection of the exclusion zone by the Federal Minister of Defense and military attachés of the former occupation powers and great powers. Third, the demand that Ferenc Nagy, not Imre Nagy, Ferenc Nagy, the exiled former prime minister of Hungary, had to leave Austria. He arrived in Austria when the uprising started, and he wanted to start propaganda, anti-communist propaganda, and Austria asked him to leave the country. Ferenc Nagy has to leave the country. Fourth, a visa ban on the passports for all Hungarian immigrants was decided. Fifth, a tighter control of the western border. Sixth, a stop of political activities by Hungarian refugees and exiles in Austria. And seventh, also the disarming and internment of armed refugees who crossed the Austrian border. So on the one hand, the lack of equipment of the very young Austrian Bundesheer, the Austrian armed forces, and the inadequate security precautions made it all the more necessary to pay close attention to and strictly adhere to the measures of neutrality law and neutrality policy. On the other hand, the events in Hungary also showed the Austrian political leadership that a neutrality that was credible on all sides offered a certain guarantee for the protection of their own country. Far-reaching consequences were therefore derived from the latter realization. And if you look a little bit further, in the era of Bruno Kreisky, when he was federal chancellor in the 1970s, preserving neutrality was considered the best foreign and security policy. But in that consequence, the armed forces, however, continued to suffer from a shadowy existence. When it did, it was used to provide good services, aid to refugees, and humanitarian measures. In the course of the uprising in Hungary, the Austrian federal government organized extensive deliveries of aid and medicine, also coming from Switzerland. As the Austrian envoy to Budapest at that time, Walter Peinsipp, who was able to re-establish telephone contact with Vienna at the end of October 1956, indicated the distribution of relief supplies carried out by the legation, I quote him, meant real propaganda for Austria, end of quote. As a result of the uprisings in Hungary, approximately 200,000 Hungarian citizens, so about 2% of the total population, left their homeland. The first and largest wave of refugees occurred between November 56 and January 57 in the direction of Austria. Nearly 180,000 of people fled from Hungary to Austria. A second, smaller escape route led via Yugoslavia in the spring of 57, enabling nearly 20,000 Hungarians to leave their country. Vienna had not been prepared for such a movement of refugees. At the end of October 1956, the Austrian Council of Ministers expected a maximum of 10,000 refugees. As of October 26 in 1956, the federal government assured every Hungarian a right to political asylum in accordance with the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees. After the suppression of the uprising, the number of refugees in Austria rose sharply, which is why new security measures had to be taken at the border. Persons who crossed the border with weapons were interned on the basis of Article 11 of the Hague Convention. For the transport of the arrived refugees into the interior of the country, private means of transport were deliberately used instead of public ones, private services. Due to the high number of people, of smugglers, so-called escape helpers, already operating at the Hungarian border, entering Hungarian territory with the aim of bringing people into Austrian territory was prohibited. The aforementioned exclusion zone, the Sperrzone, was set up along the border, and as already mentioned, press reporting was prevented there. Let me come to the consequences in my third chapter of my lecture, the consequences, Austria's renunciation of supranational integration in 56. So the intensified Eastern propaganda campaign against Austria continued, which unswervingly practiced only a state neutrality, but not a neutrality of heart. A direct consequence of the suppression of the October and November uprisings in Hungary was Austria's abandonment of its bid for full membership in the European coal and steel community. The uprising in Hungary that was suppressed in autumn 56 by Russian tanks had immediate repercussions on Austria's European integration orientation. The wish by Chancellor Julius Raab and Foreign Minister Leopold Figl that was briefly articulated for candidacy for being a candidate for membership in the ECSC, including also from considerations of domestic policy towards the coalition partner, the Social Democrats, was now to be withdrawn right away. Again, protectionist intentions for the defense of the nationalized industries and resistance on the part of the socialists prevented also early membership in the ECSC. But in the shadow of the Hungarian crisis, there was no option anymore for an Austrian membership in the ECSC. Humanitarian refugee aid and the political support that was also provided with it for the threatened neighbor strengthened the Austrian feeling of self-confidence, awakened national self-awareness, and contributed toward the existence of a kind of neutrality identity. So the escalating domestic political developments in the neighboring country and the Eastern accusations of propaganda that Austria was violating its neutrality forced the federal government to give in to its over-ambitious integration policy. In the wake of the Hungarian crisis and the Soviet Union's military interventions, the federal government felt compelled to withdraw the ECSC candidacy already announced in October by Raab and Fiegel. Subsequently, Pravda urged Vienna to maintain its neutrality, while Izvestia urgently warned against joining the ECSC. The fact remains, in view of Eastern warnings of a breach of neutrality, Vienna's room for maneuver in foreign policy was further limited by the events in Hungary, and pushing the ECS accession application would only have put water on the critics' mills. This had to be prevented. As a result, the desire to join the ECSC could no longer be maintained. And this was a fundamental decision to withdraw from ECSC accession ambitions, not only meant non-participation in the EEC, decades of the renouncement of supranational integration until Austria's EU accession in 1995. This cleared also the way for the development and the full opportunity to develop perpetual neutrality. Initially, the renunciation of supranational integration was not voluntary, but forced by external and in part also by internal circumstances. Only in the course of time, this renunciation was internalized. I now come to my fourth point, alternative integration solutions, the Rapatsky Plan, and attempts at mediation in the German question 57-58. It was Chancellor Julius Raab who first made a cautiously implicit recommendation of the Austrian example of neutrality in a radio address on January the 20 January 1957. I quote Raab talking to the Austrian population in a radio speech. I quote him: "Hungary borders directly on neutral Austria, and some form of neutrality would certainly be readily accepted by the Hungarian people. But the creation of a neutral state on this side and on the other side of that ideological demarcation line, which according to Churchill's saying at that time is called the Iron Curtain, would certainly contribute substantially to a general calming down in Central Europe. All the more so because no one would have to feel threatened in his security by this construction." End of quote. What was concerned by Austria's neutrality solution was also something along the lines of a Central European responsibility for Austria. And this was, however, shown limits right away by the Soviet Union when, during his visit to Austria in April 1957, Anastas Mikoyan made a clear objection known to the recommendation that had been made by the People's Party Chancellor Raab shortly before for an Austrian solution for Central Europe free of atomic weapons. In the meantime, it had also been realized in the Kremlin that Austrian neutrality could signify a kind of Trojan horse for the cohesion of the socialist camp in Central Europe. The project that had been proposed by British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan in the year of 1956 for a large free trade area appealed to Vienna without it having been remarked upon there at this endeavor amounting to a shattering of the plans of the ECS states to form a common core European market. When those negotiations on a large free trade area got bogged down in 57, 58, the Austrian Chancellor considered internally the EEC Anschluss, which however was in turn suddenly rejected by the Socialist coalition partner. But thus in 1959 and 1960, only a small free trade zone remained as a last resort. Austria acted only with a hesitation and restraint in the so-called Stockholm Group, which led to the formation of the European Free Trade Association. Participation also took place under the condition of endeavoring to build a bridge to the EEC as soon as possible. But that was not to be realized so quickly. Alternative variations that in the end were not to get their chance were to be a bilateral customs union, an expansion of EFTA, or an association concept like Greece did it in 1961. I now come to the Rapatsky Plan. The Rapatsky Plan was an attempt, as you well know, for a limited demilitarization in Central Europe presented by the Polish Foreign Minister Adam Rapacki. During the 12th term of the United Nations General Assembly of the 2nd October 57, on the 2nd October 1957, Rapacki suggested that creating of a nuclear-free zone in Central Europe, which would go a long way to alleviating the political tensions in Europe. According to the proposal made by Rapatsky before the United Nations, the two German states should will to prohibit the production and storage of nuclear weapons on their territory. The Polish People's Republic would then follow suit. The Czechoslovakian government joined the Polish in their proposal, and the GDR also agreed to join the initiative. And following these first signs of approvals, Rapatsky distributed written copies of his speech with relevant explanations to representatives of various foreign powers, representatives, and held negotiations with Swedish, Norwegian, Austrian, Soviet, Czechoslovakian, and East German delegates. Henceforward, for almost 8 years, the Rapatsky Plan was discussed internationally in different versions. These were 3 further texts, 58, 62, and 64. So how did the Ballhausplatz react? How did Austrian politics react? Austria's diplomats received Rapatsky's proposal with great interest. In a typical Austrian manner, they behaved receptively, rezeptives Verhalten at first. Before expressing themselves, they sounded out the reactions of other foreign ministries. The Austrian ambassador to Paris, Alois Vollgruber, was interested in Paris' option and opinions. The negative attitude had not changed at the Quai d'Orsay because the perspective goal of the whole proposal seemed to be the neutralization of Germany, the withdrawal of the American troops, and a final row of disbanding of NATO, which opposed French objectives. The French attitude was clear. Considering Poland, the proposal is being examined thoroughly, but it was and is unenforceable. The Austrian deputy ambassador to Warsaw, it was Helmut Liedermann, in February 58, expressed the belief that the Rapatsky Plan has been the first independent proposal since the Second World War ended from Eastern side, from Eastern satellite state side. The Austrian ambassador of Warsaw, Stefan Verhofstadt, earlier in January 58, confidentially reported that the goal of Władysław Gomulka is the withdrawal of the Soviet troops, which was in Polish national interest. Nevertheless, it would be only possible if the German question is solved and the international tension, at least in the region, ends. And Julius Raab was to act exactly according to this assessment in the same year, 1958. Kurt Waldheim, the Austrian ambassador to Ottawa in Canada, pronounced strictly confidential in February 58 that according to diplomatic sources, the Polish suggestion would be deleted from the agenda because of the Western powers' rejection, primarily Washington, Rome, Bonn, Paris, in the face of Warsaw's efforts. According to Waldheim, Washington did not dedicate enough effort to handling the question at all, which was taken by Ottawa with great regret. On the 28th of February 58, the Austrian ambassador in Washington reported in detail on the State Department's observations, and he found that the Polish suggestion was dealt seriously in the State Department, but he, the ambassador, was sure that it would be rejected in the end. With some delay, Stefan Verhofstadt, the Austrian ambassador to Warsaw, also gave a summary of Soviet-Polish negotiations in his report written on the 28th of March 58. He regards it as a Polish success that they could temporarily prevent Soviet nuclear weapons from being installed in Poland by having the Rapatsky Plan made public. Nevertheless, they had to clear everything with Moscow from then on. Austria's political leadership reacted very differently. While Julius Raab and Leopold Figl were initially open-minded to Rapatsky's plan, Bruno Kreisky, the Undersecretary of State in the Foreign Office, and later on Foreign Minister, reacted negatively. At the same time, Kreisky opposed ideas of the German Social Democrats, the SPD, and its proposals for a policy of third force in contrast to Adenauer's policy of the strength. The concession of neutrality to Austria in 1955, Kreisky argued, was just a lure by the Soviets for the Germans. Like Adenauer and then also Raab, Kreisky rejected the Rapatsky Plan for a nuclear-free zone in Central Europe, in contrast to British and German Labour politicians and Social Democrats. Think about Hugh Gaitskell or Erich Ollenhauer, arguing that the realization of the Rapatsky Plan would mean a weakening of the position of the West. The German ambassador in Vienna, Karl Hermann Müller-Graf, therefore also emphasized that in Vienna, quote, no Western counter-pressure was needed at all because, quote, the views of Ballhausplatz continue to be clearly directed against anything that might contribute to weakening the military defenses of Western Europe, end of quote. And this seemed, according to Müller-Graf, to refer to Austrian security interests that would see the country's neutrality preserved only in the protection of NATO. Whether this was really so and how realistic it was at all remains to be seen. But from all this, three things can be summarized with this Rapatsky issue. First, Austria's neutrality policy in 1956 and 57 had to be oriented to the geostrategic military and security policy framework of Europe. Second, Austria's neutrality was a product of the Cold War and ultimately generated a Western-oriented neutrality policy with leanings toward the EEC. And third, it was finally Chancellor Raab himself who saw the only suitable approach to resolving the conflict, confrontation, and tension in Europe in the solution of the German question, and that is where he now started. So I will come to this last point, the Raab German initiative. Well, it's obvious that Julius Raab played an interesting role as foreign policy maker. Normally, the Austrian contemporary history is always focusing on Raab as a man of domestic politics, but in reality, he was very open-minded also for foreign issues. So attempts by the People's Party Chancellor Julius Raab in 1958 for the solution of the German question intended to use the Austrian model case to overcome the division of Germany. What was meant by Austrian model case? Not the status of neutrality, but the way to get a solution with the Soviet Union, the methods how to achieve with Moscow. The Austrian Chancellor actually presented the Austrian procedural path as a solution model for overcoming the division of Germany in the form of a mediation proposal in February 1958. According to Raab, the procedure between Bonn and Moscow would be based on a joint commission of experts, which initially was not to go beyond a narrowly defined thematic framework. The context for launching this initiative by Raab went through Foreign Minister Fiegel, his predecessor and by now special representative at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, Karl Gruber, the German ambassador in Vienna, Müller-Graf, and the German Foreign Minister, Heinrich von Brentano. Adenauer's proposal, which he made in March 58 for a neutralization of the GDR, was also connected with Raab's initiative, or was, I think, then also a consequence of it, in exchange for postponing the goal of reunification. In May 1958, Raab again ventilated a four-power commission to settle the German question. According to Müller-Graf, the idea behind his plan was, I quote, to find a bridge between the Soviet demand for negotiations of the two German states and the German or Western rejection of such negotiations. It was the idea of the balancing and equilibrium policy pursued by Vienna between the blocs. According to Karl Gruber, the four-power commission was not to negotiate with official representatives, but probably with experts from both the Federal Republic and the so-called, he mentioned it, the so-called GDR, and in this way reach agreement on some fundamental steps that would lead to reunification of Germany. The concrete idea was an electoral law on the basis of which a constituent assembly would have had to be convened, which would then have to draw up a common constitution without prejudice to the continued functioning of the two states. The necessity of an amnesty law was emphasized, which was to amnesty the rulers and the apparatus of the Soviet zone, as it was said by Karl Gruber. In this way, golden bridges were to be built for the GDR, resistance was to be dispelled, and at the same time, the face of the Soviet Union was to be preserved. Important, the face of the Soviet Union was to be preserved. However, the mediation action soon met with reservations, objections in Bonn, and also both the USSR, Moscow, and the GDR, the Pankow regime, publicly spoke out clearly against this project. So what can be concluded from that story? And you see how serious it was meant in the newspaper of the Frankfurter Rundschau. You can read the headline, Wien rollt deutsche Frage auf. Initiative dringt auf Wiederherstellung der Rechtsbasis. This was an article in the Frankfurter Rundschau, and in the Industriekurier in Düsseldorf appeared in May 1958. It was reported about Raab's Deutschland-Initiative. So the German newspapers, also the Austrian ones, reflected on these ideas and made it publicly known that the Austrian Chancellor wanted to be a mediator, want to be give inspirations for developing a methodology on the German unification issue. But what can we conclude? By 1957-58, however, it had already become too late to apply for and to test the Austrian model case. The expectation or promise that German unity could be brought about with the much cited policy of the strengths was to prove a false prediction and fallacy as early as the second half of the 1950s. The GDR began to become a fixed, indeed an indispensable factor for Soviet domination in Central and Eastern Europe, a fact that was clearly recognized at the Ballhausplatz. The German question thus seemed insoluble for a long time because of the deadlocked constellations between East and West. If then there was only hope for a solution to the Berlin crisis later on, 58, 59, but this was not the case in 57 and 58. Let me conclude with 5 remarks and theses. As a summarizing conclusion, 5 aspects may be named. First, Austria's foreign policy, Europe policy, and integration policy are only to be understood within a larger European international context. Along those lines, there was a high degree of dependence upon other countries and determination from abroad. That began with the control by the League of Nations in the early 1920s up to the 1930s. Think about the Geneva Protocol, the Lausanne Protocols, and continued with efforts at satellisation through Nazism, which led to Finis Austria in 1938. After 1945, the occupation of the capital Vienna and the country by the 4 powers followed, and they continue to have an observing and intervening effect. Second, only after 1945 did Austria define itself as to a large extent convinced about the idea of Europe and its possibilities for a unifying formation, whereby, starting in 1955, the state treaty and neutrality weakened, hindered, and restricted this acknowledgement up to the end of the Cold War on the continent. Third, the state treaty and neutrality were first and foremost a means to an end for attaining and ensuring state and national independence, and this meant independence from the German question. Fourth, beginning with the 1950s, Austria's latching on to merrily participating in European integration projects also served the achieving and maintaining of a new Austrian nation state. So the thesis by Alan Milward about the European rescue of the nation state, this very famous book that the first steps to Western European integration served the restoration of the nation state, is really also to be confirmed with the Austrian case. Participation in the European recovery program in order to save national unity, economic unity. Also the Soviet occupation zone in Austria profited from the ERP funds, and to restore the Austrian nation state. Last point, in the context of the Hungarian crisis, the Austrian model of neutrality crystallized early and clearly for the first time. Austrian neutrality gained international recognition. Acceptance on the part of the superpowers was symbolically expressed by the Vienna visits of the US Vice President Richard Nixon in December 1956, and also by the Soviet Deputy Prime Minister Anastas Ivanovich Mikoyan in April 1957. So Austrian neutrality policy became an active one, an Western-oriented one, and acquired also very important, a very early humanitarian dimension. So this was the presentation of my paper. I would like to say thank you very much for paying attention, for watching me. And I would like to add that my paper was based on different works. First of all, I published a book in 2015 on Modellfall für Deutschland, die österreichische Lösung mit Staatsvertrag und Neutralität, so model case for Germany, question mark. The Austrian solution with state treaty and neutrality. This is this book here was published by the Studienverlag in Innsbruck, and 5 years later, in 2020, last year, 2020, big volume also appeared and was published by the Austrian Academy of Sciences publisher in English, From Saint-Germain to Lisbon, Austria's long road from a disintegrated to united Europe, covering the years from 1919 to the EU Treaty of Lisbon in 2009. And I have also to mention that Gerald Sturz and Wolfgang Müller recently published also a German version of a revised English version, Austria in the First Cold War and the Austrian State Treaty and Neutrality from 45 to 55. It's a remarkable new edited book. And actually I'm working on an edition of documents by the Austrian Foreign Ministry from starting with 1949, with the establishment of the People's Republic of Hungary, up to the uprising in 56 and the aftermath 1957. This will be a printed edition together with Ibolia Murba, and hopefully will appear next year. So thanks again for paying attention. And now I'm happy to receive your questions and to have a hopefully also substantial discussion. Thank you.